December 18, 1944, the Ardennes. A grey dawn bleeds over the frost-covered hills of Belgium. The forest is silent until the sound of heavy engines breaks it. Panzers grind forward, exhaust fumes mixing with the bitter mist. A German colonel, his name lost in the confusion of reports, stands in a narrow valley outside Stavelot. Before him, hundreds of steel drums glisten beneath a pale sun, stenciled in bold white letters, U.S. Army fuel, high octane. He removes his glove, touches the cold metal. For a moment he almost smiles. After weeks of starvation, the tanks of the Reich would drink again. Around him, men cheer. Mechanics rush to siphon the fuel, desperate to feed the engines of the last German offensive in the west. Then, silence. Above the trees, the distant growl of aircraft builds. Allied fighters. The colonel looks up, realizing what this means. Even with this captured fuel, they cannot outrun the storm. As he watches the sky darken with contrails, the truth hits harder than any bomb. Germany's victory now runs on borrowed fuel and borrowed time. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was running on fumes. The German war machine, once the most feared on earth, had become a beast starving for oil. Its lifeblood, the steady flow of petroleum from Romania's Ploiești oil fields, had been choked off by relentless Allied bombing. Synthetic fuel plants inside Germany, built to turn coal into gasoline, were smoking ruins. Luftwaffe pilots counted every liter. Tank commanders rationed each kilometer. For the first time, Hitler's armies weren't defeated by men, but by math. By early December, the Führer faced a truth his generals dared not speak aloud. Without fuel, there was no mobility, no blitzkrieg, no Germany. Yet in his headquarters deep in the Eifel Mountains, he clung to a final plan. A counterattack that would shock the Allies, split their lines, and force a peace on his terms. The operation would be named Wacht am Rhein. Watch on the Rhine. It would strike through the Ardennes forest, the same terrain where Germany had humiliated France in 1940. But this time, the stakes were far greater, and the odds almost suicidal. The plan was brutally simple. Smash through thin American lines, cross the Meuse River and seize the port of Antwerp. The Allies would be thrown into confusion, their supply lines cut, and perhaps, just perhaps, the Western powers might negotiate, but there was a problem no map could hide. The offensive required vast quantities of fuel, millions of gallons to feed more than 2,600 tanks, thousands of trucks, and armored half-tracks. Yet Germany could barely fuel a week of sustained combat. By the time the offensive was approved, entire panzer divisions had to siphon gasoline from training vehicles and staff cars. Field Marshal Walther Model, a realist among loyalists, warned Hitler bluntly, "The operation will fail for lack of fuel." Hitler's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "We will take it from the enemy." The Ardennes offensive was not only a gamble of strategy, it was a bet on logistics theft. Each German spearhead carried only enough fuel to reach the Meuse, not to return. Beyond that, their survival depended on capturing Allied supply depots. The very success of the attack would hinge on luck, weather, and the speed of their advance. To command this strike, Hitler turned to his most ruthless SS leader, Joachim Peiper. A 29-year-old colonel of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, a veteran of the Eastern Front, Peiper was known for his audacity, brutality, and ice-cold precision. His orders were clear: drive west at all costs, ignore resistance, and capture Allied fuel dumps along the way. For the Germans, fuel wasn't just a resource, it was salvation in liquid form. To hide their intentions, Hitler imposed absolute secrecy. Even German divisional commanders received their operational orders days before the attack. Radio silence was enforced. Fake messages and camouflage misled Allied reconnaissance, and then came the weather, a cruel ally. Dense fog and heavy snow grounded Allied aircraft, the one factor that could have exposed the massive German buildup in the forests. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes erupted. Over 200,000 German soldiers surged forward in three main thrusts. U.S. outposts were swallowed whole. Tanks emerged from the mist like phantoms. The surprise was total. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge. But beneath the chaos, German commanders were already checking their fuel gauges. Some panzer crews were ordered to advance only at night, conserving every drop. Supply trucks lagged behind, unable to keep up. Even before reaching the Meuse, Piper's spearhead was running dangerously low. When they captured the first Allied depot near Stavelot, it wasn't just a victory, it was oxygen. Yet as Piper's men filled their tanks with American gasoline, Allied air power was returning to the skies, and somewhere among those officers, a colonel, standing before 50,000 gallons of captured U.S. fuel, understood the bitter irony. They had won the battle for fuel, but lost the war for survival. That realization begins to take shape as we move deeper into the landscape of chaos and frozen ambition. The Ardennes in December was not a place for tanks. The region straddling Belgium and Luxembourg was a maze of dense pine forests, winding roads, and icy valleys, beautiful in peace, but treacherous in war. Snow blanketed the ground in thick silence, and frozen rivers turned into both bridges and traps. In 1940, German tanks had rolled through this same region like lightning. 4 years later, the terrain remained unchanged, but the men and machines were not. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was older, scarred, and stretched thin. The men in Piper's SS Panzer Regiment wore mismatched winter gear, scavenged from fallen Americans. Their vehicles coughed black smoke, their tracks creaked with age. Yet they moved, because Hitler demanded it. The element of surprise worked brilliantly at first. American units, many of them green and inexperienced, were scattered along thin defensive lines. At dawn on December 16th, the 6th Panzer Army smashed through the Losheim Gap, while Piper's armored spearhead charged toward the towns of Stavelot, Stoumont, and La Glaise, a route through Belgium toward the Meuse River and Antwerp beyond. Every hour, Piper's radio operators reported the same message: fuel low. Every order from above repeated the same answer: capture Allied fuel. German intelligence had identified Key American supply depots in the region, filled with tens of thousands of gallons of precious gasoline. To reach them, Piper had to move fast, before the skies cleared and the Allied Air Force returned. The irony was brutal. The entire offensive, built to cripple Allied supply lines, was itself starved of supply. To save time, Piper's columns bypassed pockets of resistance, leaving American units alive behind them, a decision that would later prove fatal. By December 17th, his tanks reached Stavelot, where they found several Allied fuel trucks abandoned in panic. For a moment, fortune smiled on them. German engineers tested the fuel. It was good. American fuel, high octane, clean burning, and perfect for their engines. But there was a catch. The fuel was in U.S. gallons, not German liters. Conversion errors led to miscalculations. Tanks thought to be half full were nearly empty. Meanwhile, the roads clogged. Burned-out vehicles, wrecked trucks, and snowdrifts forced the columns to crawl. The roar of engines turned into a groan of frustration. Behind the lines, the German supply network disintegrated. The few remaining fuel trucks were bombed by Allied aircraft or trapped in the traffic chaos. Men began to siphon fuel from wrecked tanks, from staff cars, even from generators. And still, the offensive pressed on. By December 18th, Piper's men captured a massive Allied fuel depot near Stavelot. Tens of thousands of gallons of U.S. gasoline stacked in drums. Soldiers cheered, officers shouted orders, and mechanics rushed to refuel the stalled armor. It was a scene of temporary triumph amid desperation. But in the distance, the faint rumble of artillery grew louder. Allied reinforcements were closing in from all sides. The fog that had hidden the Germans was lifting, and with it came the roar of P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons. The fuel they had prayed for now made them targets. Rows of barrels glinted in the winter sun, visible from miles away. One airstrike, one lucky bomb could turn victory into fire. Piper realized his advance had slowed to a crawl. Every gallon captured bought only a few more miles of survival. The Meuse River, once the objective, was now a mirage beyond reach. For Germany, the offensive had transformed from a daring gamble into a slow-motion disaster. The roads that were meant to lead to Antwerp were now graveyards of frozen men and broken machines. And amid this chaos, the image of that German colonel, staring at 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel, became the perfect symbol of the war's last illusion. That one more haul, one more miracle, could reverse the tide. It wouldn't. Because across the front, another reality was taking hold. That logistics, not bravery, would decide the outcome of the Ardennes. The human, tactical, and technological faces of that truth reveal themselves next. The human angle, soldiers running on hope. They were boys and veterans, frostbitten and exhausted, wrapped in stolen American coats. By mid-December, Piper's men had been fighting for days without proper rest. Rations had frozen solid. Fuel fires were banned at night for fear of being spotted by Allied aircraft. The Ardennes wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a frozen purgatory. For the German soldier, every liter of gasoline meant another hour of life. Crews slept inside tanks to stay warm, the air thick with oil fumes. When an engine started, men cheered as though salvation itself had arrived. But each kilometer westward carried the same quiet dread. The tanks might die before they reached the next depot. They scavenged relentlessly. American jeeps, knocked out Shermans, even civilian vehicles were stripped for parts and fuel. SS troopers traded cigarettes for petrol cans with local villagers, promising payment that would never come. One report from a captured German driver simply read, "Without fuel, we freeze. Without fuel, we die." Behind the bravado and propaganda, they all knew it. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting not to run out. The tactical angle, Piper's advance, and the bottleneck of fate tactically, the German plan had brilliance and fatal flaws. The Ardennes offered cover, concealment, and the element of surprise. But its roads were narrow, winding, and utterly unsuited to the massive columns of armor that poured into them. Piper's Kampfgruppe, roughly 5,000 men with 117 tanks and armored vehicles, was designed as a spearhead. Its task, break through and move fast, leaving slower divisions to mop up. Yet speed required fuel, and fuel required supply lines that simply didn't exist. Each Tiger tank guzzled nearly 500 liters every 100 kilometers, and the offensive demanded hundreds of kilometers. When American fuel depots weren't found quickly, the entire column stalled. By December 18th, Piper's lead elements reached Stavelot but couldn't push farther. Their fuel trucks lagged miles behind. American engineers, realizing the threat, blew up bridges ahead of the German advance, forcing costly detours and burning precious fuel with every extra mile. What followed was chaos. Dozens of German vehicles ran dry and were abandoned in the snow. Mechanics drained them to keep a handful of tanks moving. Radio logs from the 1st SS Panzer Regiment recorded desperate transmissions. No fuel for next phase. Vehicles halted, awaiting supplies. Enemy air attack imminent. Tactics built on momentum were collapsing under physics. The mighty armored thrust that Hitler envisioned as his last lightning strike became a slow, grinding crawl through white mud and fear. The technological angle, engines of war. Engines of desperation fuel wasn't just fuel, it was chemistry, precision, and compatibility. And here too, the Germans were losing. Their panzers and half-tracks ran on high-grade gasoline. American fuel, while abundant, wasn't always suitable for German engines without modification. The Luftwaffe's synthetic fuels, made from coal hydrogenation, burned hotter but produced less energy, a technical marvel on paper, but a mechanical curse in practice. By late 1944, Allied bombing had crippled Germany's production of synthetic fuel. The Leuna and Blechhammer plants were reduced to rubble, cutting off more than half of the Reich's output. Even when fuel reached the front, its quality varied so wildly that engines seized or burned out. Panther tanks, technological masterpieces but logistical nightmares, required meticulous maintenance. In the freezing cold, oil thickened, gearboxes cracked, and engines stalled before combat even began. German engineers resorted to heating engines with burning rags and hot water stolen from village wells. Meanwhile, the Americans had solved their own logistical puzzle. They'd built a miracle, a continent-spanning supply chain called the Red Ball Express, capable of moving thousands of tons of fuel, ammo, and food from the beaches of Normandy to the front. Allied tanks might burn twice as much fuel, but they never ran dry. That contrast, between the Germans' shrinking pool of synthetic fuel and the Americans' industrial flood, symbolized more than a logistical imbalance. It was the difference between an empire fading into delusion and one powered by production. And as Piper's column crawled westward through the snow, each sputtering tank was a grim testament to that reality. Three faces of the same truth. Men, tactics, and machines all running out of breath together. Next, we turn to leadership, to the enemy's response, and to the moral weight that crushed those who saw the inevitable end. The leadership angle. Commanders at the edge of reason, Joachim Piper was not just a soldier. He was a symbol. Young, ambitious, fiercely loyal to the Waffen-SS, he embodied the paradox of German command in 1944. Brilliance strangled by obedience. He knew the Ardennes offensive was a logistical fantasy. He knew his tanks could not reach Antwerp. Yet orders were orders, and Hitler's voice, echoing through field headquarters, was absolute. From his forward command vehicle, Piper's world was a blur of snow, wreckage, and static-filled radio transmissions. He was expected to perform miracles with half-empty fuel tanks and exhausted men. Reports from other SS officers show that he pleaded repeatedly for resupply, not for ammunition, but for gasoline. Every leader became a command decision. Which tanks move, which stay behind, which are abandoned. Piper was ruthless in his calculus. He burned villages suspected of harboring American forces, executed prisoners to save time, and pressed forward even when flanking units had vanished. To him, hesitation meant death, for his men and for Germany. Behind him, Hitler sat in his command bunker at Adlerhorst, staring at maps that no longer represented reality. His generals, Rundstedt, Model, and Jodl, argued in hushed tones that fuel, not courage, would decide this battle. But Hitler, isolated and delusional, insisted that fate and faith would refill the tanks. When Piper captured 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel at Stavelot, Berlin called it proof that destiny still favored Germany. For Piper himself, it felt like a cruel joke. Every victory was temporary. Every gain burned away as fast as it was found. Leadership had turned from strategy to survival, from planning to improvisation. The enemy angle, Allied order from chaos on. The Allied side, the first days of the Ardennes offensive were pure confusion. Commanders believed the German attack was a local counterstrike, not a full-scale offensive. But within 48 hours, the scale became clear. The Germans were pushing west with everything they had left. The American response was swift and brutally efficient. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's genius was not in theatrics, but in logistics. He saw what Hitler refused to. The German war machine was running out of gas. Literally, Eisenhower diverted fuel convoys north and west, creating flexible supply corridors. Allied engineers destroyed bridges to slow German armor and repositioned fuel depots beyond Piper's reach. Air reconnaissance tracked German movement even through the clouds. And when the weather cleared on December 23rd, Allied air power unleashed Hell, P-47. Thunderbolts strafed convoys. Typhoons rocketed columns trapped on narrow roads. Even retreat became impossible. Meanwhile, American infantry, the so-called citizen soldiers, adapted with astonishing resilience. Cut off, outnumbered, often surrounded, they blew up their own fuel dumps to deny the Germans what they needed most. One U.S. engineer later said, "We turned our own gasoline into fire so theirs would burn out first." By the time Piper reached L'Église, Allied units had sealed every escape route. His precious captured fuel was trapped with him, a glittering prize that couldn't move. The Allies had learned the ultimate lesson of mechanized war: control the supply, and you control the future. The moral angle, the realization of futility war is not just fought with bullets but with belief. And in the Ardennes, belief itself began to die. Among the German ranks, even hardened SS officers began to whisper the unthinkable, that the war was lost. The propaganda back home spoke of miracle weapons and final victories, but the men on the ground saw only burned tanks, empty fuel drums, and frozen comrades. That moment, standing before captured American fuel, encapsulated the moral collapse. They had taken what they were ordered to seize, yet it changed nothing. Even victory had no meaning. Reports from captured German officers reveal an emotional fatigue rarely seen before. One colonel wrote in his interrogation notes, "We had fuel for a day. It gave us life for a day. Then we died the next." It wasn't just the Allies closing in. It was the weight of realization. The German army, once driven by ideology and arrogance, was now bound by entropy, a machine cannibalizing itself. For the colonel in that icy field, surrounded by barrels of American fuel, the truth burned colder than the snow. Germany wasn't defeated on the battlefield. It was defeated in the factory, in the refinery, and in the skies. He looked at the full drums and saw the empty future. Each of these angles, leadership, enemy, moral, forms the backbone of what came next, the turning point. The moment when captured fuel, hard-won and precious, became useless, as the tide of war turned decisively against the Reich. The air in the Ardennes was still and heavy on the morning of December 19th, 1944. The fog that had sheltered the German advance for 3 days began to lift, revealing a frozen world of smoke, steel, and scattered wreckage. Piper's column, the spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army, had done the impossible. It had reached the outskirts of Stavelot and seized one of the largest Allied fuel caches in Belgium. 50,000 gallons of American gasoline sat before them, drums stacked in long rows beside the road, painted olive green and marked U.S. Army Motor Gasoline. The barrels caught the dim light of morning like dull mirrors. For men who had fought for days on fumes, it was a sight close to salvation. Piper ordered immediate refueling. His crews worked frantically in the snow, hauling drums by hand, siphoning fuel through rubber hoses. The air filled with the sharp metallic tang of gasoline. Engines roared to life one after another, Tiger IIs, Panthers, half-tracks, the guttural chorus of an army reborn. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like the offensive could continue. But it was an illusion. Even as tanks were being refueled, distant artillery began to echo from the west. Allied forces, alerted by radio intercepts and reconnaissance reports, were converging on Stavelot. The U.S. 30th Infantry Division had been redeployed from the north, and elements of the 82nd Airborne were being rushed into position. By the time Piper's men finished fueling, American engineers had already blown the Key Bridge across the Amblève River, cutting his escape route, and above the sky was clearing. For 4 days, bad weather had grounded Allied aircraft. Now, as the sun burned through the mist, the thunder of engines returned, not from tanks this time, but from the skies. The roar of P-47 Thunderbolts rolled over the valley. The first bombs hit the road outside Stavelot. Columns of smoke and fire erupted where German trucks had been lining up to refuel. The barrels that had promised life now became death traps. One fragment struck a drum, igniting it instantly. In seconds, the valley turned into an inferno, fuel-fed flames leaping 30 feet high. German soldiers dove for cover as fire raced across the snow, chasing the lines of spilled gasoline. Panthers and half-tracks burned together, their steel shells glowing orange in the cold. Piper watched from the roadside as chaos consumed his victory. His precious captured fuel, the miracle that was meant to save the offensive, was turning the battlefield into a pyre. Still, he refused to retreat. He believed he could break west, reach La Glise, and regroup there. But every move westward meant consuming the same fuel he had just risked lives to obtain.
Every explosion, every destroyed truck, was another nail in the coffin of his advance. By nightfall, what had been a fuel-rich forward column was now stranded in a frozen labyrinth of fire and smoke.
Piper's tanks had gas enough for only a few more hours of movement. The rest stood silent, dark hulks against the snow. The colonel, perhaps Piper himself or one of his officers, walked the line of smoldering drums. Around him, the snow was streaked black with soot. He kicked one of the remaining barrels. It sloshed half empty, all that effort, all that blood for a few more miles. Nearby, a mechanic tried to start a Tiger tank. The engine turned once, twice, and died. He looked at his colonel, waiting for orders that wouldn't come. The realization was setting in across the front. The great German counter-offensive was running out of fuel faster than it was gaining ground. Behind them, Allied reinforcements were pouring in. To the north, the 1st U.S. Infantry Division was counter-attacking toward Malmedy. To the south, General Patton's Third Army was turning north with terrifying speed. And above, the sky belonged to the Allies once more. That night, the fires at Stavelot burned bright enough to be seen for miles. German soldiers warmed their hands on the wreckage, staring into the flames. Some whispered that the fuel had betrayed them. Others said it was fate, that the Reich was doomed not by the enemy, but by its own hunger. The colonel said nothing. He just watched as the flames reflected in his eyes, an empire burning through its last reserves. The next morning, Piper would try one final breakout, but the fire at Stavelot marked more than the destruction of a fuel dump. It was the moment the German dream of reversing the war was consumed by its own smoke, and as Piper regrouped at La Glaise, his situation, and Germany's, would go from desperate to impossible. By December 21, 1944, the dream of the Ardennes offensive was already dying, but no one on the German side dared to say it aloud. Piper's column, once the pride of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had driven deeper into Belgium than any other German force. Yet the price was catastrophic. His route was littered with burned vehicles, frozen corpses, and shattered hopes. Out of more than 5,000 men who had begun the push, fewer than half still marched with him, and most of their tanks were dry. In La Glaise, a small Belgian village nestled between snow-covered hills, Piper's troops took shelter. They had captured fuel, glorious, much-needed fuel, but lacked the means to transport it. American shells pounded the roads, Allied fighters strafed anything that moved, and every gallon burned brought them closer to immobility. It was the cruelest paradox imaginable, surrounded by gasoline, yet powerless to use it. Inside the village church, now a makeshift command post, Piper spread his maps beneath the flickering light of a lantern. The markings were grim. Allied units were closing in from 3 sides, Stoumont, Stavelot, and Trois Ponts. His supply line to Germany was severed. His remaining fuel could take him only a few miles. The colonel, who had once stood proudly over captured U.S. drums, now understood the full weight of that moment. This wasn't a battle for victory. It was a fight for escape. Still, orders from Berlin insisted on holding ground. "You are the tip of the spear," they said. "Do not retreat." But the spear had blunted. The point had broken off. By December 22nd, Piper's men were surrounded. American artillery rained shells on La Glaise, reducing homes to rubble. The snow was blackened with soot, the air filled with the constant whine of aircraft. Inside the village, German soldiers crouched behind broken walls, clutching rifles that had frozen in their hands. Outside, the wreckage of the Tiger II tanks lay scattered like monuments to hubris. Mechanical giants that could crush anything in front of them but couldn't move without gasoline. Each one was a fortress, stranded in the snow. Piper walked among them, his uniform caked with ash. His men looked to him for orders, for hope, but there was none left to give. The colonel who once promised them a path to victory now faced only 2 options, surrender or destruction. He chose defiance, but not delusion. On the night of December 23rd, Piper ordered all remaining vehicles destroyed. Crews poured out what fuel they had left and set their own tanks ablaze to prevent capture. The fires lit up the village, casting a ghostly orange glow across the snow. The engines that once roared in triumph now howled in death. And as those massive machines burned, so too did the illusion of Germany's might. At dawn, Piper gathered his surviving men. With only small arms and dwindling ammunition, they slipped through the forest under cover of darkness, abandoning their vehicles, wounded, and the precious barrels of captured American fuel that had promised salvation. Behind them, La Glaise burned. The columns of black smoke rose into the pale winter sky, a funeral pyre for the last German offensive in the west. When American forces entered the village later that day, they found scenes of devastation, tanks still smoldering, ammunition scattered, and untouched drums of fuel, stacked in neat rows beside the road, 50,000 gallons, enough to drive an armored regiment left behind by men who no longer had the means or the time to use them. An American officer surveying the wreckage wrote in his report, "They fought hard, but their machines died before they did. They lost not for lack of courage, but for lack of fuel." In the larger scope of war, Piper's failure was decisive. His trapped column became a symbol throughout the German army, not of heroism, but of futility. The offensive that was meant to divide the Allies had instead divided Germany's own hopes, and somewhere among the ruins, perhaps standing before those same abandoned barrels, the German colonel looked at the fuel that had cost so much and realized it had never been enough. Not enough to reach the Meuse, not enough to change the outcome, not enough to save the Reich. That realization would spread far beyond the Ardennes. Across every front, commanders would feel it, in the empty fuel tanks of the Luftwaffe, the silent U-boats drifting powerless in the Atlantic, the frozen trucks in Hungary. Germany's war was ending, not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet sputter of engines that could no longer turn. The flames at La Glaise were the last light of the Reich's dying dream. The next stage reveals what came after, the collapse, the reckoning, and the numbers that told the true cost of this final gamble. By late December 1944, the snow-covered fields of Belgium were no longer battle lines, they were graveyards. The German advance that had promised to split the Allies in two had stalled completely. In its place stood burned-out armor, shattered bridges, and the exhausted remnants of once proud divisions. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final offensive in the West, was collapsing. For the Allies, the tide had turned quickly. As soon as the weather cleared on December 23rd, the skies filled with hundreds of Allied aircraft. Bombers struck the roads behind the German lines, cutting every route of retreat. Fighters prowled low, attacking convoys, fuel trucks, and columns of fleeing troops. The same fog that had protected the Germans now betrayed them. Every movement stood out against the white snow. In a matter of days, the offensive's momentum dissolved. The German 6th SS Panzer Army, the spearhead of Hitler's great gamble, was forced to fight defensively just to survive. The once fearsome tanks that had terrified Europe were now being abandoned and blown up by their own crews. Statistics told the story with merciless clarity. Germany had committed over 200,000 men, 1,600 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft to the Ardennes offensive. By mid-January 1945, more than 80,000 of those men were dead, wounded, or captured. Nearly 700 tanks and armored vehicles had been destroyed, many not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. American losses were heavy too, around 75,000 casualties, but the Allies could replace what they lost. Germany could not. The fuel situation, the very core of the plan, had been catastrophic from the start. Allied intelligence estimated that by late December, the entire Wehrmacht in the West had less than 100,000 barrels of gasoline available, barely enough for a week of operations. Piper's own division had begun the offensive, with fuel for only 3 days of full-scale combat. The captured American fuel, those 50,000 glittering gallons at Stavelot, might have powered his tanks for a few hours at best. It was a drop in an ocean of need. Across the front, similar stories played out. German columns stalled, stranded miles from their objectives. Some units, cut off from supply, fought to the last bullet before surrendering. Others simply abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot through the forest. In one captured report from the 2nd Panzer Division, a commander wrote bitterly, "Our tanks are magnificent, but our fuel is imaginary." Meanwhile, Allied forces regained their rhythm. Generals Patton and Bradley coordinated massive counterattacks, pushing the Germans back toward the Siegfried Line. Patton's 3rd Army, having pivoted north with near superhuman speed, smashed through the southern edge of the Bulge by Christmas. American fuel trucks, thousands of them, raced forward to sustain the advance. Ironically, the same Red Ball Express that had once fed the Allied invasion now fed the counteroffensive that would crush Germany's last hope. In Hitler's headquarters, reports arrived that defied belief. Divisions were gone, bridges lost, fuel depots destroyed. Entire panzer regiments were stationary, waiting for supplies that would never come. The Führer blamed cowardice, treason, and fate. Anything but reality. But for the men on the ground, reality was undeniable. They had gambled everything on speed, surprise, and captured fuel. They had won none of it. By January 1st, 1945, what remained of Piper's once mighty Kampfgruppe had slipped back across the German lines. Less than 800 men survived. They brought no tanks, no trucks, and no fuel. Only the knowledge of what they'd lost. And as news of the failed offensive spread through the Reich, the truth that one colonel had realized before the flames of Stavelot became clear to all. Germany had reached the end of its reach. The fuel drums of Stavelot were not just a battlefield detail, they were a prophecy. The empire was running on empty, and the war was far from over, but its end was now visible on the horizon. Next comes the full reckoning, the global aftermath, the collapse of Germany's fuel war itself. By early 1945, the fuel drums of the Reich were as empty as its promises. The failure of the Ardennes offensive didn't just cost Germany men and machines. It destroyed the last illusion that the war could be sustained at all. In the months that followed, Allied bombers completed what Piper's defeat had begun. Operation Point Blank, the Allied campaign targeting Germany's synthetic fuel industry, intensified to apocalyptic levels. Every refinery, every hydrogenation plant, every oil train was struck again and again. The Great Luna Works, once producing 5,000 tons of fuel a day, was reduced to rubble. The Blechhammer and Pörlitz complexes, responsible for the majority of Germany's synthetic oil, were obliterated by American B-17s. By March 1945, German fuel production had dropped by over 90%. Entire Luftwaffe squadrons sat idle for lack of aviation gasoline. Fighter pilots were ordered to glide home to conserve what little remained. Tanks were hidden in barns to save fuel for emergencies that never came. In some cases, infantrymen were ordered to tow artillery pieces by horse. A return to the pre-industrial age amid the wreckage of modern warfare. Captured German staff reports reveal a military strangled not by defeat in battle, but by logistics. One general wrote bitterly, "We have turned our tanks into statues. They stand as monuments to our lost oil." The Allies, by contrast, were drowning in abundance. American production of aviation gasoline alone exceeded 5 billion gallons in 1944, enough to fuel the entire war effort several times over. Tankers crossed the Atlantic in convoys so vast they seemed endless. The contrast could not have been more brutal. A Germany of empty depots facing an America of overflowing pipelines. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March, they found German resistance uneven and scattered. Many units surrendered without a fight. Those who didn't often couldn't move their armor at all. Their tanks left abandoned by the roadside, turrets aimed at nothing. The logistical heart of the Reich had stopped beating. Hitler, still issuing orders from his bunker in Berlin, refused to accept it. He demanded counterattacks, demanded the impossible. But his commanders, now realists to the core, knew the war was over. Some called the situation Die Treibstoffkrise, the fuel crisis. Others called it simply the end. For the Allies, intelligence officers studied the wreckage of German fuel depots with fascination. In one British report from March 1945, a colonel wrote, "The German war effort collapsed for want of oil. Their defeat is a triumph not merely of arms, but of industry." Piper's abandoned barrels at Stavelot became a symbol within Allied briefings, a cautionary tale and a lesson in strategy. Every future planner studying the war would note the same equation. Fuel equals mobility. Mobility equals life. For Germany, the realization came too late. By April 1945, as Soviet tanks roared toward Berlin and Allied forces swept through the Rhineland, the Wehrmacht's armored divisions ceased to exist as functional fighting units. Their engines were silent. Their steel hulks littered the roads. In the end, the war that began with blitzkrieg, the war of speed, engines, and gasoline, ended with stillness, and somewhere, in a snowy Belgian valley long since melted, the ashes of 50,000 gallons of American fuel lay soaked into the ground. A reminder that the Reich's last gamble had burned through everything. Its machines, its men, and its future. The Battle of the Bulge would enter history as Germany's final offensive. But to those who survived it was something more haunting. The moment they realized their empire had already run dry. From this wreckage, one question remains, not of who won, but of what the war itself had revealed about the modern world. A reflection on the deeper meaning of fuel, power, and inevitability awaits. War, in the end, is not decided by courage. It is decided by combustion, the story of the German colonel who captured 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel, only to realize it couldn't save him, is not just a tale of defeat. It's a parable of modern warfare itself. It was never about who fought harder, but who could keep the engines running longer. For Germany, World War II began with speed, with engines roaring across Poland and France, with tanks fueled by certainty and ambition. But by 1944, the same machines that had once made them unstoppable now anchored them to the earth. The Reich's dream of eternal motion had become a slow-motion collapse. The Allies learned the opposite lesson. They fought not for glory, but for logistics. Behind every tank at Bastogne stood a pipeline, a convoy, a mechanic in muddy overalls who made sure the fuel never stopped flowing. The war was won not only in the skies or on the beaches, but in the refineries of Texas and the ports of Cherbourg. The colonel's realization that Germany was doomed even in the moment of triumph carries a universal truth. Every empire runs on something finite: oil, steel, time, or belief. And when that fuel runs out, the engines of history grind to a halt. Standing before those American barrels, surrounded by snow and silence, he didn't just see the end of his army. He saw the end of an era, a world where ideology thought it could outrun reality. The flames of Stavelot were not just the burning of gasoline. They were the burning of illusion, the moment when a nation that had waged war on the modern age was consumed by it. History would move forward on the same engines that left him behind. And in that final moment, amid the ashes of his captured prize, the colonel understood what every commander since has known but few have admitted aloud. You don't win wars by taking fuel. You win them by never running out.